Greetings, thank you all for tuning in for another video. Just as glad to see me as I'm glad to see you. So, I've been doing a lot of thinking on the subject of freedom, liberty, and liberalism lately, and I've come to some conclusions which are perhaps not as popular as others that I pose on this channel, but I think are valuable nonetheless. And I wanted to share them for the sake of inviting you all to participate in a conversation which I think is not only productive but incredibly important and useful, because it concerns a subject which we're all interested in, which is freedom. Now, lest anyone should mistake what I mean by the term liberal or liberalism, as I'm going to be using those in this video, I do not mean in the sense that those terms are often used to describe, say, or indicate a Democrat, a leftist, or a progressive by the standard of American partisan politics. That's not what I mean. What I mean by liberalism is a very basic definition, which is the classical definition or conception of liberalism. The belief that individuals have a natural right to be free. That is, to speak freely, to think freely, to express themselves freely, to build a life that suits their own character, and to practice whatever religion they choose, insofar that they don't cause any harm to others or infringe upon the rights of others. This is a belief that all Americans, I think, all Westerners and moderns pretty much agree with and conform themselves to. And so by that standard, all of us are liberals, or most of us are liberals, I should say. Now, the conclusion that I've come to is that we should be very cautious in our exalting of freedom for its own sake. Because one of the things that I've noticed in my personal study of history, in my personal observations of not only myself, but also others, is that freedom in the absence of temperance, self-control, discipline, and sound moral judgment is a perfect recipe for self-destruction. It is a perfect recipe for ruin. And so, while it is often the case that we find ourselves having these conversations about what we ought to do in society, how we should apply the art of politics or really any method of socially engineering society to maximize freedom, to make people more and more free, what we don't often acknowledge is that an increase of freedom is accompanied by an increase of a burden. A burden of understanding that the decisions that we make are going to determine our fate and our destiny. Because once you assume more freedom, you assume more responsibility, more duties and obligations. And if we ignore those duties and obligations and responsibilities, well, naturally it turns to self-destruction. And why? Well, it seems that human beings have a predisposition for developing appetites and habits and patterns of behavior that tend towards self-destruction. It's like we become intoxicated with freedom, we become intoxicated with power, we become intoxicated with abilities and talents and the acquisition of things that are supposedly making us better. And we end up pursuing those things at the expense of other people. Like we end up pursuing material things, for example, at the expense of treating others well. Just a classic example. Another example would be the consumption of ultra-processed foods, which is like normalized in the United States. It's like we develop these normalities and these patterns of behavior that are detrimental to us, and yet because they are normal, because we are free to do them, and because it may be prohibitively costly or inconvenient for us not to do them, we do them anyway. We do the very things which are detrimental to us anyway. And all the while, meanwhile, we're free. It's like we haven't considered the fact that freedom, while it is a great and wonderful thing, and I don't want anybody to get the impression that I'm anti-freedom or anti-liberalism or anti-liberty for its own sake. No, I'm wanting to emphasize the fact that, let us not assume that just because we are free, that we're somehow by necessity better off. It's like, no, freedom is not an end, it is a means to an end. It is a means to undertaking certain actions and making certain decisions which should be informed by our moral preferences, our values, our taste, our sense of duty and obligation and responsibility. Okay? As we become more and more free, as we embrace more and more freedom, we have a responsibility to understand that, hey, just because we're more free doesn't necessarily mean we're better off. In fact, if we abuse our freedom, we actually will undertake the very actions that will cause us to become slaves. Now, a macro historical example that I will use in order to drill this point home, it concerns the United States. So since the conclusion of World War II, the United States has arguably occupied the position as the most remarkable and powerful civilization to ever exist. And in the decades that have transpired since then, leading up to 2024, I can't help but reflect and ask whether or not it is the case that this society became so prosperous, so free, so full of entitlement, that the people became lazy and complacent and took for granted the fact that they had a moral, or they had certain moral obligations and responsibilities and duties to uphold. And the only reason I say that is because I think most people can agree that there is a substantial level of political, social, economic, and cultural dysfunction and disunity in this country, and that is not by coincidence. It could all be traced back to certain decisions by the actions of people who have occupied positions of power and influence. People who are supposedly free, the freest people on earth. And so, by some epic and ironic twist of fate, we find ourselves in the shoes of so many who have come before us. Considering once again, not whether or not we should or shouldn't be free, that's not the question. It's what do we actually do with the freedom we possess? That is the question. And that's the question that I'll leave to you, or I'll leave with you. All right, so if you have any comments, questions, critiques, etc., please leave those down in the comment section below. As always, if you like this video, like it. If you disliked it, dislike it. And until next time, I hope to hear from you guys soon. Bye-bye.